Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Belén López-Pérez. She is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Manchester. Her research interests include empathy and interpersonal emotion regulation across the lifespan, as well as happiness and well-being. And this is our second interview, by the way, so everyone go watch our first one, which is very interesting. And Dr. Lopez Perez, welcome back to the show. It's always a huge pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ricardo, for inviting me for a second time.
Yeah, sure. So let's start with the emotion regulation then. So first of all, what is it, psychologically speaking?
Right, so basically emotion regulation is any process that we implement in order to change how we feel and how we express our emotions. So when I mean, what I mean about processes is, like the different actions. These actions, can entail, for example, listening to music, talking to other people, or, for example, engaging in exercise.
And there are at least two different kinds of emotion regulation, right? We have intrapersonal emotion regulation and interpersonal emotion regulation. So, what is the difference there?
Okay, that's a very good question. So intrapersonal basically refers to the actions I do to change how I feel. So, for example, I may be upset, and I may decide, to listen to some cheerful music, just to try to cheer myself up. And on the other hand, we have interpersonal emotion regulation, and depending on who you ask, the definition can be very different, because some people would define it as, the actions that we undertake to change our emotions when seeking the help of others. So, for example, I'm upset and I decide to call my friend and and tell my friend what happened to me, so that my friend kind of a listening ear, and just seeking help from my friend can help me to feel better. This is one definition of interpersonal, and some other people, including myself, would define it as those actions that we do in order to change the emotions of others. So basically, for example, I notice in this case that my friend might be upset. Maybe my friend even potentially has not said anything to me, and I decide, okay, I'm just gonna take her to the cinema, so to cheer her up. But it is important to understand, because I'm talking all the time about cheering up other people, but sometimes we engage in actions that do not always make others feel good, but they can always they can also make them feel bad.
So, emotion regulation certainly has something to do with social competence, right? And
Mhm.
could you explain how, and if so, if it really has something to do with social competence, is it that one of the two different types of emotion regulation has more to do with it than the other? Like, for example, interpersonal regulation being more related to social competence than intrapersonal regulation, for example, or not?
Yeah, that is correct. I mean, the two forms of emotion regulation are closely linked. So this means that, for example, if I'm good at changing how I feel, I'm gonna be better at changing how other people feel. But if we try to understand the link with social competence, so for example, being able to interact better with other people, for example, have more significant, better social relationships, the interpersonal component seems to be more predictive than the intrapersonal one. And basically, it is because if you're good at interpersonal emotion regulation, this means that you're gonna be good at reading how other people feel, and you're gonna be good at selecting the kind of actions you decide to implement to change the emotions of others. So it's not surprising that actually this has a strongest the strongest link with having appropriate interpersonal functioning.
And so there are different kinds of interpersonal emotion regulation strategies, correct?
Yes, there are, and again, depending on who you ask, different authors would suggest different strategies. But I mean, some of the strategies that have been found, across different models would be, for example, reappraisal. This is also called cognitive engagement, which basically means having the capacity to change how people see the situation. Basically, having the capacity to make them see the situation in a positive light. Another strategy that has also been mentioned, across different models is distraction, which is basically diverting, the attentions away to something completely different. Overall, we could say that there are some strategies that we would call them engagement strategies, because these basically allow you to elaborate on how the other person is feeling, whereas others, and this would include, reappraisal, for example, offering a listening ear, talking to the other person, about their feelings. And on the other hand, we have disengagement or diversion strategies, which basically work in the opposite manner. They do not engage with the emotional response. They do not elaborate on it. But, on the other hand, they just, try to divert the attention, to something completely different. And here we would include, distraction. We could include humor as well. And, potentially, and, this is something that I know that some researchers are investigating. I'm also investigating it myself, can have very different consequences. For example, in some studies that I have conducted myself, I'm actually, working on the write-up currently. Basically, what we have found is that, distraction strategies seem to be more negative for the person who implements it, what is called in the literature the agent, but also for the social relationship as well between the agent and the target. So it seems that, using consistently strategies that do not engage with the feelings of the target do not have, very positive consequences.
So, I mean, this has a lot to do with what we could call reading the room, right? Because having a sort of competence when it comes to interpersonal emotion regulation has a lot to do with reading the context, I mean, knowing the context, the person we're dealing with, and perhaps also what we are better at when it comes to interacting with the other person in question, right?
Yeah, that's a very good observation. I mean, we need to have the capacity to understand how the other person is feeling, and you have mentioned context, which is very important, because initial research in emotion regulation was a little bit black and white, in the sense that, for example, there were certain strategies that were, called like adaptive strategies. For example, reappraisal. It was, like common belief, reappraisal is good, because you're asked, you're asking people to see the situation in a positive manner. Whereas, for example, suppression, which is, kind of actions aimed at suppressing the emotional response, not allowing the person to express how they're feeling, it was seen, as completely, maladaptive. However, we know that this may not be entirely true, and we need to take into account the role of context. Because, for example, if we use reappraisal all the time with ourselves or with other people, sure, this is not going to be adaptive. Think, for example, that I may decide, to lose weight, and I put on a diet. Imagine that I go to the office and, some colleagues, have brought some treats, and and I don't know what to do because I'm on a diet, and I imagine that for health reasons, okay, I need to lose weight. If I use reappraisal, I could say, well, it's just one-off situation. It's nothing major is gonna happen. Just do it. Some treats. Once. But imagine if I apply this reasoning constantly, I'm not gonna fulfill my goal. Of losing weight. For health reasons. So what I'm trying to say with this is that, initially reappraisal was seen, like as the gold standard, as the super adaptive regulation strategy. But we know that potentially it might not always be the case. And, we really need to be, sensitive to the context. Or for example, suppression that was seen, very negatively. Let's gonna imagine, for example, a funeral. It may, suddenly, I don't know, something may cross your mind, and you're about to laugh. But if you implement suppression, that in theory is negative, actually this is very adaptive, for that particular context, because laughing at a funeral, might not be, the most adaptive, emotional response. And by implementing suppression, you may actually, suppress, the laugh, and adjust, to that particular context.
So, and does culture also matter here? I mean, are there, for example, cross-cultural differences when it comes to interpersonal emotion regulation?
Well, we know very little about that. We know very little. There's, I would say there are a couple of papers, one of mine looking at children, and another paper by some other researchers. However, the way they define interpersonal, is someone seeking the help of others. So, the results are not directly comparable. And I'm currently writing another paper, on the role of culture as well. And there are important, cultural differences. It matters, for example, the emotion that the other person might be experiencing. For example, we know that in collectivistic cultures, we tend to value the harmony of the group. So potentially, when we see all the people feeling upset, especially, if it's something that involves the agent, for example, it's going to be more motivated, to try to change, the situation, and try to change how the group might be feeling, as compared to, individualistic cultures in which, the emotional responses, might be more detached, and, how the agent potentially might feel, in regards to the agent might not be, so connected, or might not be so relevant, as in collectivistic cultures. Um, Also, the type of connection between the agent and the target. For example, there are, certain cultures in which the dimension of power distance, for example, the level of hierarchy, depending on the context, may apply. Whereas, in other cultures, for example, here in the UK, power distance is quite low, so relationships are more egalitarian. This is going to impact as well the kind of strategies that you implement. For example, in societies that score very high in power distance, the kind of interpersonal emotion regulation that you could observe, for example, in the workplace context, is going to be very different as the one that you would observe, for example, in societies or cultures in which power distance would be more egalitarian, because we're not going to see that many differences in the type of strategies, for example, between, I don't know, group of friends, romantic partners, or employee manager. However, in cultures that score high, in power distance, we're gonna see, dramatic differences, because, of the imbalance of power, for example, in the workplace. So yeah, there are differences, but there are still, many questions that, remain that remain unanswered somehow, and we need further investigation, to better understand why such differences exist, and what other variables, may account for those differences.
But, for example, in Western societies, do we know if children, as they grow older and as they grow into adolescents, teenagers and adolescents, for example, do they get more competent when it comes to their interpersonal emotional regulation? Does that happen? or not?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does happen. I mean, as you said, the data that we currently have, it's basically subscribed to the Western world. We would need, to understand a little bit more, what happened in other cultures. But we know that, as children develop and grow, basically they become more sophisticated at the kind of strategies that they use. For example, we know that. By the age of 7 or 8, they're more capable of using the regulation strategy of reappraisal, for example, whereas, younger children, we're talking about children of, who might be 3-4-year-olds might not use reappraisal that much, and they use more, for example, diversion strategies that I was mentioning before. So, for example, distraction, humor, or, for example, giving a toy or sharing something, with their friends, and, as they grow older, they have the capacity to engage, in more engagement strategies, hold more complex conversations, and elaborate on the emotions of the target.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as they grow older, they perhaps acquire a wider array of interpersonal emotion regulation strategies, and they are more attuned to perhaps the specific contexts and situations where they should apply one or the other, right?
Yes, exactly. Because I mean, interpersonal. What we need to understand, I know that and in psychology we tend to do that. We separate concepts, to try to understand them. But interpersonal emotion regulation doesn't happen, in isolation. Of course, I mean, this depends, on other emotional competencies that will develop as children develop and grow. And for example, for interpersonal emotion regulation to happen, we need to understand how the other person might feeling. And we also need to understand that potentially what this person might feel might be different to how I may feel in that situation. It also involves, a development of emotion understanding in the sense of comprehending that different situations can lead to different emotional responses, which can have different consequences. So this sounds, like very obvious, but it's actually kind of complex, and and it involves, quite a lot of processes basically to take place in order, for children to fully, separate, how they feel compared to how other people feel, and understand, that even, different situations can lead to different emotions, but also within the same situation, different emotional responses might happen. So until, all these different processes take place, the interpersonal emotion regulation that can happen, could be potentially more rudimentary. That's why, very young children use these, diversion strategies, because, potentially cognitively speaking, they're not, they might not be capable, of holding like very complex, emotional conversations with, with the targets, but they notice that there's something wrong, and they try to fix it, the best way that they can. So potentially could be like sharing a treat, or or for example giving their friend like their favorite toy or something like that, because they know that there's something going on and they try to fix it. But of course it's not going to be very cognitively sophisticated until they reach an age where they're capable of engaging in these more complex strategies.
And as you mentioned there, it might seem obvious, but perhaps it's more obvious for us as adults because we are sort of, let's say, fully developed. But for children, teenagers, adolescents, it's not as obvious. And even for us as adults, sometimes we might get across someone who has specific, I don't know, personality traits or some specific psychological traits where they don't react to the strategies we are used to, and also perhaps if we are put in a novel cultural context, I mean, the strategies we tend to apply would not work there, and so we would feel also kind of lost, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point. As adults, we think that we know everything, but even as I'm just gonna, I mean, I'm not gonna go into the clinical groups, which we could explore later on,
Yeah.
but just focusing on typically developing adults. Sometimes we fail in instances, where we try to regulate other people's emotions. And it might be because even if, we try to put ourselves in the shoes of the other person, for example, what we may want the other person to feel might not necessarily match with how this person might want to feel in that situation. And, and this can create, some kind of conflict between, the agent and the target. Think about, for example, I don't know, a parent who sees, their child, for example, procrastinating. Yeah. And the parent knows that the child has a very important exam to take. Imagine that, it's a very important exam that potentially may influence, the outcome in terms of going to university. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's quite a lot of at stake, in passing that exam. And maybe the parent, sees that the child is procrastinating, is not doing what they should be doing, and they might, get upset and angry, and they may decide to actually make the child feel bad. And this is not, potentially how the child wants to feel in that situation. And sometimes this can work. This affect worsening, can potentially help the child, to react and say, okay, I need to change what I'm doing and crack on, and study to pass the exam. But in other instances, it may create, the opposite result. The child, just getting very upset and, creating just actually conflict and confrontation within the family. So, I just described, like a very regular situation. And what I'm trying to say is that, we believe that we're excellent at interpersonal emotion regulation, but it might not necessarily be the case, because, there are so many factors involved that, sometimes it's very tricky.
Mm-hmm. And in our first conversation, we talked about empathy. Is there a link between it and interpersonal emotion regulation?
Yes, of course. Because some authors would say that empathy is actually the very first step for interpersonal emotion regulation to happen, because you need to understand how the other person is feeling in order to engage in interpersonal emotion regulation. So, for example, if I meet my friend and I don't realize that they may be upset, even if they are, but for whatever reason, I do not realize that, they're feeling this way, I'm not going to do anything, to cheer them up, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So empathy, it's really, really important for interpersonal emotion regulation, because, it could be, let's say, as, the motivator to engage in interpersonal emotion regulation.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not asking at this stage in particular, but perhaps somewhere in the future with more research done on emotion regulation, do you think that this research could help children develop social competence when they're lacking it for any reason, like they've been socially deprived for some reason, or perhaps they have some autistic traits or something like that, for example?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I believe that, this can have practical applications. Actually, I, with some other colleagues, we developed a game. It's not unfortunately available anymore online. It was called Emo Discovery. And basically it gave, children the opportunity to interact, with a virtual character, to try to cheer them up. And, and it was providing children feedback. So it gave them the opportunity, to learn while interacting with these virtual characters. And yeah, I believe that, it can have important applications. For example, you mentioned children with autism, especially, I would say high functioning autism, and children with ADHD. Children, for example, who experience social anxiety could benefit as well, for interventions, fostering interpersonal emotion regulation, because we know that these groups have difficulties and challenges when interacting with others. And typically developing children may perceive them as, different, and, and potentially, they may perceive that sometimes this other group of children can react, awkwardly. So I think that, by conducting interventions well, first conducting research to understand what kind of strategies they use, how they perceive, the other children in different situations, to be feeling, because potentially they might not be capable at picking up how the other children might be feeling, and understanding what kind of regulation strategies they use. Then, we can then implement interventions tackling, for example, the use of not very adaptive regulation strategies, showing them, what works when. And of course, this would have an implication first on the confidence when interacting with others, which we know that, it is very, very important, but also in their social relationship skills, because, if they're capable of engaging in successful interpersonal emotion regulation, sure, their social relationships are going to be more adaptive, and this is going to have consequences also for their overall well-being.
So perhaps related to that, is there a link between children's emotionality and their academic functioning?
Yeah, there is a clear link. So basically, emotionality, which is slightly different to emotional regulation, is the tendency to experience different emotions. And we know that for a wealth of reasons, there are people who tend to experience more positive emotions, but there are other people that, for different reasons, might tend to experience more negative emotions. And we know that this negative emotionality is linked to, unfortunately, lower academic achievement. This was, something that was well established in research, and basically what we did is we tried to understand whether particular emotions might be linked to poorer academic performance. And what we saw is that both anger and sadness were actually were linked to lower academic achievement. But interestingly, these links were mediated by the relationships with the peers. So what does this mean? That basically it's not that it's just, the tendency to experience anger or sadness that leads, to poor academic performance. Is that this the experience of anger and sadness is linked to poorer social relationships, which in turn, was predictive of lower academic achievement, because, if children do not have social, meaningful social relationships within, the school setting, of course, this is going to have, an impact of how they feel in that particular context, and this is going to impact, their overall performance.
So, still within the realm of emotions, but changing topics a little bit, what are emotion goals?
Right. So basically, I mean, we go back to emotion regulation, and basically emotion goals are the emotions that I want to feel, either in general or in a particular context. But we could say that are desired emotional responses.
And so we have both positive and negative emotional goals then, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes I know it may sound weird because we would tend to assume that we always want to feel positive. So this is what we would call positive emotion goals. For example, I want to feel happy. This is a positive emotion goal, but sometimes we can also have negative emotion goals. I want to feel angry. And I know that it may sound like strange, because I think that there is a tendency to assume that we're driven by hedonic consideration. So trying to maximize how good we feel and try to lower the negative emotions. But there are instances in which it might be adaptive to actually be motivated to experience negative emotions.
I mean, there are several social contexts and situations where it's adaptive and also motivating to experience negative emotion, correct?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the first situation that would come to mind would be, avoiding danger. If you are like happy and, potentially you might not be able, for example, to escape from a building, which might be on fire, for example. And experiencing a little bit of fear could motivate you, to say, okay, there's a danger, I need to escape as soon as possible from here. Or, for example, let's go imagine a situation in which, I don't know, someone might be taking advantage of us. And, for example, I don't know, some people may not feel like brave enough, but you decide that you need to confront this person who is taking advantage of you. So in that situation, feeling a little bit of anger could motivate you to actually confront the person taking advantage. So yeah, there are situations in which it is very adaptive, indeed.
Mm-hmm. And so within the realm of emotion goals, there are general and contextualized emotion goals, correct? Could you explain that?
Yeah, so general emotion goals is how you would like to feel in general. And we could say that in those cases, usually, we tend to be driven by hedonic considerations, because in general, we want to feel good, and try to minimize the experience of negative emotions. And then we have contextualized emotion goals, which is how I want to feel in a particular situation. So, for example, in a confrontation context, I might be motivated, to experience anger, because I know that anger is going to be helpful in order to confront the person taking advantage of me. Or if I'm, I don't know, in the workplace, imagine that I have to I don't know, develop a project in collaboration with other people. In that particular context, I might want to feel happy, because I know that, by feeling happiness, I'm going to be able to collaborate with others better. So sometimes our contextualized and general emotion goals might coincide, might be the same, but there are instances in which, the contextualized emotion goals might be very different. For example, in the case of confrontation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And might there be a problem emotionally if the two do not correspond? I mean, if there's a disparity between the general and the contextualized emotion goals, or if, for example, in a particular situation, we might not be feeling the way we should expect us to feel, or we should want us to feel, something like that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The problem, I would say, doesn't come from a mismatch between the general and the contextualized, because as I said, in general, okay, there are exceptions, and we can talk about the exceptions later on, but in general, people are going to be hedonically motivated. So in general, people are, would like to feel happy. And a different story, is what happens in the particular different context. So of course, we're going to see potentially a discrepancy between the general and the contextualized, but this is not the problem. The problem comes when, well, there could be different problems. One could come from the inflexibility. For example, imagine that I'm hedonically motivated and I want to feel happy, and I want to feel happy all the time, irrespective of the context. This could be, a big issue, because, if we think, for example, about the confrontation context, if I feel happy all the time, I might not be able to go and confront the person who is taking advantage of me, for example. Or it might be a problem, going back, to the example of escaping from a danger. If I'm, actually, trying to be happy all the time, maybe I'm not gonna pick up that there's actually, something going on, and I need to escape, the building as soon as possible, because otherwise, I'm going to be on fire as well. So this could be an issue, the inflexibility. The second issue is having emotional preferences that may not be completely adapting for the specific context. So for example, let's say that you ask me how I want to feel in a context of collaboration, and I tell you that actually I want to feel, a little bit angry, because I know that anger is going to help me to get my way. This is potentially not going to be very adaptive. Or for example, if on the other hand, you ask me how I want to feel in a context of confrontation, and I tell you that I do not want to feel like very angry, this could be an issue as well. So we need to look at first, flexibility, and second, whether the emotion that we want to feel help us to attain the goal that we're trying to fulfill in that particular context. And there's already quite a lot of research that has, outlined what emotions may facilitate different behavioral goals. So for example, if we try to collaborate, we know that happiness is the right emotion to feel. If we try to seek support from others, sadness may facilitate that. Escaping from danger, fear, and if we try to confront others, anger. So, when you look at those particular contexts and you ask people how they would like to feel, if they mention other emotions that might not be the ones that I have mentioned, potentially there might be some issues going on, and we have found that actually with clinical groups.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine, I mean, I'm not sure if you study this specifically, but I would imagine that probably personality traits would also play a role here, right? Because, I mean, in the examples you mentioned, I was imagining that if someone is collaborating with other people but wants to take advantage of them, perhaps in that case, that person would score very low on agreeableness, for example, and they want to take advantage of others, or in the reverse case, I mean, if someone is being exploited by others, but they score very high on agreeableness, perhaps, I mean, they should feel angry, but they really can't or don't feel angry because, I mean, they really don't like to go against other people, let's say.
Yeah, that's a very good observation. As far as I'm aware, I think that you're opening a new research line here. As far as I'm aware, there's no study that has looked directly into personality traits, but I agree that they moderate, that they could moderate, the effects that have been observed, and the proposed relationships that you have suggested, seem reasonable to me. What we have found, though, is there are some studies that have looked at borderline and have looked at bipolar. I mean, there's, some colleagues, who have investigated bipolar. I have investigated myself borderline, but we did, both groups is, first look at traits, because, there are bipolar traits and borderline traits, and what we have seen is that those traits might be linked with what we call maladaptive emotion goals. So, for example, in my case, what we found is that borderline personality traits were linked not only to a higher general anger emotion goal, so in other words, wanted to feel anger most of the time, but also wanting to experience that significantly in other contexts as well, not only in confrontation but also in collaboration. And then we also replicated this finding with people who had the actual diagnosis of borderline later on. So yeah, I think that traits definitely can play a role as well, and can provide meaningful information. So definitely worth to look at in the future.
Yeah. So, and are emotion goals in any way related to well-being? And if so, how?
Yeah, of course they are. I mean, one of the first studies that were conducted, it was just focused on typically developing adults, not even clinical groups. And what it was found is that wanting to feel happy all the time, so this inflexibility that I was mentioning before, was actually linked to lower well-being. Contrary, to what people would think, because basically what these researchers demonstrated is that, having the capacity to be flexible and having the capacity to be motivated to experience negative emotions in certain contexts was, linked to higher psychological well-being. Later on, there has been some other research with clinical groups, as I was mentioning, and we know that not being motivated, for example, there's some studies, I haven't conducted it myself, this is another group, but they looked at depression, and what they have found is that depressed individuals, individuals with depression, they are more motivated to experience sadness. And they also, I mean, they found this using explicit measures, but also implicit measures, like, you know, the kind of music they wanted to listen to. So, you know, looking at emotion goals can provide us with, you know, very important information about how people want to feel. And this is very relevant to understand why people experience emotion dysregulation issues, and you know, issues with the with how they feel and how they would like to feel, that, you know, can inform current interventions.
Yeah, and the bit you commented there about happiness, we'll get into conceptualizations of happiness later in the conversation, but just to say that, yeah, I've talked with other people that really question or, I mean, bring objections to the table when it comes to us, particularly in the West, being too focused on happiness, because that doesn't seem to be healthy. Right.
Yeah, it's not healthy, and also, I mean, it's not only how one wants to feel, also how much people value feeling happy all the time, because it is important to feel happy, but I think that there has been, I don't think that this has gone, you know, in our favor, but there has been, you know, quite a lot of I don't know, effort to say, you know, like, people should feel happy all the time, when we know that, you know, this might not be, you know, the best thing to feel, because we know that, for example, you know, making mistakes and feeling bad can actually, you know, be motivated, and can help us to change and grow, and you know, and just by feeling happy all the time, we're not gonna do that. In one study, we have currently this paper under review. We looked at people with borderline, and, you know, we asked them to fill out, I mean, to report, you know, over 10 days. It was a longitudinal study, every day, how they were feeling, how they would like to feel, and they also, well, how much they value feeling happy, and their emotion dysregulation. And what we found is that basically emotion dysregulation was predicted by wanting to feel happy all the time and valuing excessively feeling happy. So, you know, it can be counterproductive, this approach, and I think that this is something, you know, that should be investigated further.
So, just to end this section on emotion goals, you also studied the emotion goals, and this is a very sensitive topic, of sexual offenders. So,
Yeah.
what could you tell us about that?
So, so basically, okay, we in this research we compare sex offenders with general offenders, with people who have not committed any kind of offense. I mean, we match them by age, gender, and education, and what we found, similar actually to depression, is that, you know, sex offenders wanted to feel sadder. And they actually found sadness to be more useful. So, you know, they thought that, you know, feeling sad, you know, would be something more adaptive than potentially than the general offenders, or than the controls. So it is interesting because, you know, it shows us that how they want to feel is, you know, significantly different to how other people might want to feel in those contexts. And I think that we can understand a little bit better, you know, their emotional reactions.
And do you think that understanding that could have some implications for psychological interventions with this group of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to be cautious, because, I mean, as far as I'm aware, you know, this is the one of the few pieces of research that has looked into it. So, of course, I mean, further research is needed. But basically, you know, from our findings that, you know, focus on, they had a preference and perceive sadness as more useful, potentially, you know, could be linked to other treatments, you know, focus, for example, on the use of sex as coping, at least, you know, to the extent that sex may be used as a coping strategy when feeling sad, or, for example, you know, feeling sad may actually trigger, you know, a sexual urge, as a coping response. So, if this finding that we found, would be replicated in other research, maybe it's something that, interventions could take into account, to what extent this preference for sadness and this, perception of sadness as more useful might be linked, to this sexual urge that they may have, and I think that interventions could be put in place to target that.
Mm-hmm. So changing topics now and talking now a little bit about political psychology, because it's interesting what I read in your work, because in political science and political psychology, we tend to focus on adults. But do children also have some sort of political knowledge? Are they in any way interested in politics?
Yeah. That's a very good question. As you said, I mean, most of the work has been conducted on adults. Mm-hmm. There is some work with adolescents, mainly focused, to understand a little bit how political socialization happens in the family. So, for example, if the family tends to vote, either to the left or the right or the center or whatever, whether the adolescent or young adult would potentially vote the same as the family does. And there's very, very little research conducted with children. I mean, there's some couple of studies conducted in the US, and then the piece of research that we recently published. And yes, children do indeed have political knowledge. When we talk about political knowledge in the case of our study, it's mainly focused on what it's called factual knowledge, in the sense of recognizing political characters, and we were surprised, by how much children knew. And in our study, we presented children with political characters in the UK. We also included the person who was the president of the US at that time, who was Donald Trump. And surprisingly, British children recognized Donald Trump significantly more than their own British political figures. So media, and for example, the use of when I mention media, I refer to TV, but also social media, Instagram, TikTok. Children are exposed to loads of information, and this is actually what motivated us, to look into this research, to understand, how much they knew, because they're quite a vulnerable target. And it was interesting to see that they do not only have knowledge, but they also have attitudes as well towards those characters.
And what are some of those attitudes? Do they have, for example, preferences toward particular characters with certain traits?
Yeah, so what we found is that some children seem to have very strong positive or negative attitudes towards certain political characters. So they were presented pictures. Just to to explain to everyone how it worked. We presented pictures. These pictures were in black and white. The political characters had all a neutral facial expression, and we asked children first to identify who this person was, and then they were asked how much they liked these people and why. Mm-hmm. And it was very interesting to see how confident that they were making their judgments, and also some of the open-ended responses that we collected as well, which actually made us realize how influential media can be, and not only the family context in developing such attitudes. For example, we found that British children had very negative views on Donald Trump, for example. In another piece of research, this is not published. For example, we asked children about the Queen, for example, and they had super positive attitudes about her. So it is very interesting to see how completely opposite opinions they may have about different people.
And do they have any gender stereotypes? Is it that, for example, for a political leader like a prime minister, they would prefer a man or a woman?
So, okay, that's a very good question. We didn't ask whether they prefer a man or a woman, but we asked them about the type of traits a leader should have. Uh-huh. And basically what we use is stereotypically gender attributes. So, for example, whether male attributes that being more confrontational, or being like a little bit more bossy, as compared to being more caring, empathic, and it was not surprising that children wanted their leaders to have more what it has been called stereotypical feminine gender attributes, as compared to male attributes. But something that we wonder is to what extent this is like a gender effect, or to what extent is that the way these attributes are presented could be also influenced by social desirability, because it seems that potentially feminine attributes might be more socially desirable as compared to these gender stereotypical male attributes. So I think that more research needs to be done.
But did it work the same for boys and girls? I mean, was it the case that both boys and girls had the same preference? Or...
Yes, we didn't find any gender differences in terms of the traits, how they wanted their political leaders to be, and both of them indicated that they wanted their political leaders to display these stereotypical feminine attributes, of being caring, empathic, being open, to the opinion of other people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, getting now then into conceptualizations of happiness, what are they, and are there different conceptualizations of happiness out there?
Yeah, so, conceptualizations of happiness basically is how people define what happiness is for them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the same, before we have talked about emotion goals, so we can have, conceptualizations of happiness that could be in general. So, for example, what happiness means for me in general, in my life, or it might be that these conceptualizations might be different depending on the context. So, for example, in the case of a child, you could say, okay, what does it mean to you to be happy, within your family? Or what does it mean to you to be happy in the school context? And it is very important, basically, to separate these conceptualizations by context, because there can be, a mismatch. So, for example, what it means to be happy in general might be different to what it means to be happy at school, because there might be particular things that may happen in that context that may be reflected, in my definitions.
Mm-hmm. And are there specific things that are associated with conceptualizations of happiness in children and adolescents, like, for example, autonomy, competence, relatedness, and so on?
So there are different conceptualizations. Mm-hmm. And there are some conceptualizations that have been repeated, across different studies that we have conducted. Especially in the field of a school, having positive relationship with friends, having leisure time, having the capacity to learn new things, having positive relationships with the school staff and teachers, and having the capacity to also make choices within the school setting. So these are conceptualizations that we have identified consistently across different studies. And yes, in another piece of research, we looked at children and adolescents, and we also measure what it's called their basic psychological needs, which is what you refer as autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Mm-hmm. So autonomy basically is the capacity to make your own choices. Competence is the feeling confident and feeling capable of achieving things, and relatedness is having positive relationships. And what we found is that for children, we couldn't really map these conceptualizations with those basic psychological needs. And we think that the reason is because children tend to have I would say, like a happiness bias. If you ask them how they're feeling, they would say that they're super happy all the time. I mean, of course, there are exceptions, but we're talking about the general group. They would say that they're super happy all the time. In general terms, I mean, not only research from my group, but other researchers have found that in general, primary school children tend to feel happier at school as compared to secondary school children. So we couldn't really map their conceptualizations with autonomy, competence, and relatedness. However, in adolescents, we could. And what we notice is that because basically we managed to separate adolescents in different groups depending on the conceptualizations that they mentioned through a statistical analysis. And what we found is that those that we label as disengaged, because basically they mention less conceptualizations around happiness, were the ones that actually score lower on autonomy and competence in the school. So why is this important? Because basically when we ask children and adolescents how happy you are, we tend to do it with questionnaires, but it is important to actually also include these open-ended questions to better understand how they're feeling in different contexts, and also allow them to express themselves in a more open and honest way, and not to impose responses by using like very strict items that potentially may not be able to capture the fine-grained distinctions of how they feel. So it was really interesting to see that this lack of mentioning certain conceptualizations were reflected into this lack of autonomy and competence, because this tell us that what you understand of happiness might be linked to your own well-being. And it reflects, of course, we don't know what comes first, if the egg or the chicken. Is it that you don't feel enough autonomy and competence that actually lead you to be kind of disengaged and and hardly mention any happiness conceptualization? Or is it this lack of happiness conceptualizations that actually lead to low autonomy and competence? Unfortunately, we will need all the kind of studies to understand this, but as far as I'm aware, there's no evidence so far about it.
And what about cross-cultural differences? I know that you've studied conceptualizations of happiness at school in children from the UK and Spain, from where you are. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we found differences. I mean, we compare the UK and the Spanish system, because I mean they're two. I mean, it's not that they're completely opposite cultures, but of course there are some cultural differences. We know that, for example, Spain is a more collectivistic culture, in which individuals tend to be more concerned, with keeping the harmony within the group setting, whereas in the UK it's more individualistic, so people take care more of their own individual goals. So we wanted to understand, whether this could have implications of how they define to be happy at school. Yeah. And what we found is that children in England, for example, mention more to be, I mean, happiness for them to be being able to make their own choices. So basically to experience autonomy. Also basically to not experience violence in the school, and having a positive relationship with teachers. The positive relationship with teachers, we couldn't really figure it out why it was more relevant for British children, but autonomy actually makes sense with the fact that the UK is a more individualistic culture, and non-violence, although it was a little bit shocking then post-doc, because we didn't know what we were gonna find, so we didn't make like we didn't have like super explicit hypothesis about this. It was more an exploratory study. When we check the statistics about violence in schools, it seems that the prevalence of violence in the UK context is is more prevalent than in Spain. So again, it seems that these conceptualizations were kind of helpful, to understand what's going on in those particular contexts. And in Spain, children mention more harmony, which again, is not surprising, because we know that Spain is a collectivistic country, and in which the group harmony and the group well-being, is something that that people try to maximize. And also children mentioned, this was kind of funny, having more leisure time. So again, we didn't know how to explain that. It might be that children enjoy more social interactions, and having these leisure activities could promote these social relationships that, I don't know, potentially might be more important in the context of a collectivistic culture. But again, these are just post-hoc explanations, and therefore we would need more research to understand first, do these results keep with other samples, and what factors can account for that, because again, these were post-hoc explanations.
Mhm. And did you find any gender differences there?
Yeah, we found, and again, it kind of matched, but it has been found previously in the literature, because girls mentioned more in their definitions that in order to feel happy, they wanted to receive more emotional support in the school context, and having positive relationship with teachers. And we know that, for example, girls value more the elements of intimacy and developing deep and meaningful social relationships. So this match previous findings. And something really interesting is that they also mentioned that for them to feel happy was about to feel competent. And we know that there's still a gender gap in regards to confidence and feeling competent, especially in certain subjects at school, like maths, for example. So it was really interesting that this again appeared through the conceptualizations, and that's why I think that the conceptualizations are worth studying, because I think that they add further information that you cannot get, for example, just with Likert scales. So it helps you to see like a more fine-grained picture, and really put children in the center of evaluation, rather than us adults researchers make assumptions of what kind of questions we should ask them. Just formulate a general question and see what happens, and it is very surprising how rich the data is, really.
Mhm. And what do you think would be some of the other applications that conceptualizations of happiness could have?
So, I mean, I think that, if we understand what matters to children and what matters to adolescents, we can put actions in place. I mean, this research of, the conceptualizations of happiness, of course, we collected data with questionnaires, and, and it was interesting to see, that what children reflect in their conceptualizations is also reflected, in their quantitative responses somehow. Not only with the basic psychological needs, but also with how they feel in that particular context. So for example, if children mention that for them it's important to learn new things, and they're not very happy, maybe the school should do something about it. Maybe the way they're presenting the material is not in a meaningful way, that that children perceive that they're actually doing something interesting and meaningful. Or for example, if children highlight things like not suffering violence, maybe they need to investigate further whether there's bullying at school, or whether there has been some violent episodes that have not been revealed for whatever reason. So I think that as I said before, this can give us information that can help us to identify what's going on in a particular context, and and help us to identify whether certain actions need to be put in place, whether those actions mean revising how we implement the curriculum at school. I don't know, it might be policies about violence or bullying. So I think that there's a scope, there's plenty of scope.
Mhm. So, changing topics now, during our first interview, we talked about something that is called interpersonal affect worsening. That is, how empathy for others sometimes can be linked to worsening others' feelings against their own wishes. Do we know if that might also have happened during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, that's a very that's a very good question, and this is what we try. This is what we try to find out in one of our research. I mean, this research, unfortunately, we couldn't collect daily life data. We tried, but unfortunately we didn't get the grant. So it wasn't possible to do that. So we have to rely, on experimental scenarios. And but I mean, during that time, I have to say that it was the time, when we were basically in lockdown. So people didn't actually could relate and could suffer, the strict, the enforcement of strict rules. And what we found is that, people were actually very motivated to engage, in this interpersonal affect worsening, especially when people were breaking, these strict rules, because, breaking these strict rules means that, you're putting other people at risk. So, as soon as people were thinking about what could happen potentially to other people or also to themselves, they were willing, to make other people feel bad. And it's not something that we only found in our, in our studies. It's something that it was also reflected, in the news. For example, it received, the name of corona shaming. People that, for example, from their balconies were shouting, at those that, for example, were not respecting the lockdown measures, that, for example, were not wearing the face mask, or that were not respecting, for example, social distancing. There has been loads of episodes reflected in the news, I would say worldwide, not only in the UK. I mean, I can recall, situations in Spain, Germany, and many other countries, where people have been motivated to make, rule violators in the context of COVID-19, to feel bad for not respecting, the rules.
And do we know if empathy have had any impact on people's support for stricter rules during the
Yeah.
pandemic, like lockdowns, for example?
Yeah, so indeed, we know that basically empathy was linked to basically be more motivated to make, the rule violators feel bad, but also for wanting stricter rules to be enforced. So basically, this suggests that empathy towards, the potential victims of COVID-19, because, the scenarios were written on a way that we were describing the actions of the of those that were violating the rules as potentially triggering, some consequences. So this empathy basically can motivate people, can motivate, to worsen the feelings of the transgressors, and to enforce, stricter rules, to avoid, for example, that there would be more victims, in the COVID-19 pandemic.
Mhm. And on the other hand, do we know if children were affected in terms of their socio-emotional development during the pandemic because they were not attending school like physically and were wearing face masks and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. I would say that it really depends on the countries. And I mean, of course, first, I mean, children were prevented, from attending schools. I'm just thinking, about the first wave. And I think that this was, pretty much worldwide. Of course, I mean, children could not, engage, for example, in play, with other children. I know that especially, the youngest ones, because I mean, the oldest ones could always, use social media to get in touch with friends. But, especially the very young ones, I think that they were the ones that suffered the consequences most, because, they somehow, lost track of, attending school, socializing with other children. So, this had an impact, in, I would say, in their progress, at school, and their social development as well, because they didn't have the opportunity to continue practicing these social skills with other children. Now, in terms of the mask, I would say, and also the impact in well-being. For example, if I think here in the UK, we suffered several lockdowns, but for example, children were not enforced to wear face masks. Whereas, in other countries, I just think, for example, in Spain, because I mean, it's a context that I know more because I'm originally from there. Children, from the age of 5 were forced to wear, face masks at school. And talking to many teachers, because I mean, through my research, I do lots of research at school. They were saying to me that it was really interesting, when they came back, after the first wave, because usually, teachers tend to foster more pro-social behavior, like, okay, you have to share things. It's important that, this is not just for you, you have to share with the other children. But with the pandemic, this actually changed because, sharing was not something that could be done, because it was like hand sanitizer, you have your own things, you don't share the things with the others. And then children only socialize with a small group of children. I'm just thinking about the bubble groups. So of course, this had an implication of for children's, for example, pro-social behavior, social skills. But I think that those who suffer more the consequences were the youngest ones, because I think that these were the ones that were less exposed to be able to interact with their friends.
Mhm. But now that they're back to school and they're not wearing face masks anymore, I mean, they're probably able to recover
Yeah.
those
Yes.
skills, right?
Yes. And also, I mean, this is something really, really positive about children, is that their capacity to bounce back and and to go back, let's say, to normal. It's I think that they find it easier than adults. Their capacity to change and to adapt to change. It's really surprising. However, having said that, if we look at the statistics, I'm just thinking, about the statistics in the UK. It's very interesting to see that even if children in principle have this capacity, the statistics are telling us that actually their mental health is deteriorating, and every year seems to be deteriorating even more. So I don't know to what extent is due to COVID, is due to not being in touch with friends, not being in the school context that much. But it seems that there are many different contextual factors that may be playing a role in this deterioration of mental health in children and adolescents both.
Mhm. But at least some of those more extreme claims made by some people that lockdowns and mask wearing and all of that must have had some irreversible psychological damage on children. I mean, those are perhaps a bit exaggerated, right?
I think they exaggerate, and I think that, again, in order to make claims, you need empirical evidence. And I think that only empirical evidence will tell. I'm sure that there are some longitudinal studies taking place. And I think that, in the near future, we will know to what extent, these children, as compared to all the children, might present, some consequences, could be, from, I don't know, their cognitive development, emotional, social development. I think that only time will tell. And I don't think that, we need to exaggerate. Of course, I mean, children were prevented to be at school, and we know that the schools play a super important role in children's development, not only from a cognitive point of view, but also from a socio-emotional point of view. And it's true that they were prevented from that, and I know that children had a very difficult time at in that particular moment. I'm thinking about the first wave of COVID, when pretty much everybody was in lockdown. But I think that I want to think that most of them by now, have regained, the capacity to interact with others, understanding other people's feelings, being capable of seeing other people's faces and understanding, what emotion this person is feeling. I want to think that this is, pretty much, back to normal. I think that, it's a matter of other contextual factors that can account, for this deterioration of mental health.
Mhm. So, one last topic then, and going back to empathy. What is the relationship between theory of mind and empathy?
So Well, some people would say that they're the same construct. I don't think that they're the same construct. So theory of mind basically is the capacity to understand that my own thoughts, beliefs, and emotions are different to other people's. Yeah. And empathy, I mean, may involve a little bit of that, but empathy also has an emotional component. So the capacity to experience compassion, the capacity to experience sympathy for another person, being able to put, oneself in the shoes of others. Of course, to do that, you need to have, theory of mind, because you need to understand how you feel, how the other person feels, because if this doesn't happen, it's gonna be like very, very difficult, for empathy to take place. And that's why, like very young children, we say that they have like kind of primitive forms of empathy, because potentially theory of mind hasn't fully developed yet. Yeah.
Would the distinction that people make between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy be relevant here?
Yes, it would be relevant, because and I think that the cognitive element of empathy would be closer to theory of mind. Actually, some people would say that they're actually the same. I know they're not the same, but for some people would be the same. They would equate perspective taking, which is the cognitive capacity of empathy, to theory of mind, whereas emotional empathy, it's completely different. And it can take a more adaptive form, like being able to express empathic concern or sympathy, or a more maladaptive response, which could be like feeling overwhelmed and distressed by how other people are feeling.
And do children need to have theory of mind skills to be able to comfort others?
So yes, I would say yes. We conducted a research with very, very young children, mostly toddlers, and basically they the more theory of mind they had, the more willing they were to comfort the experimenter, at least in our study. And it is because they understand, they could understand that what the experimenter was feeling, it was different to how they were feeling in that situation, because you're not capable to make this detachment. Basically it's gonna be difficult for them to say, well, the experimenter is upset, maybe I should do something to cheer them up. But yeah, but I want to say that even if they do not have theory of mind, still children can implement some actions. This is what I was referring at the beginning of the interview, with some strategies that would be more rudimentary, like trying to distract, or for example giving a toy. But of course it is important for them to have theory of mind, because otherwise it's going to be difficult for comforting or interpersonal emotion regulation to happen.
Great. So, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity, to have this second interview. I mean, people can find my work in Google Scholar. Over there, I think that all my papers, they can just click, and find the abstract and know more. And they could always contact me at my email as well.
Great. So, Dr. Lopez-Pérez, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much for having me once more. Thanks.
Hi, guys. Thank you for watching the interview until the end. Please do not forget to share the video, subscribe to the channel, and also leave a like. And if you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links in the description box of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters. Berger Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alec, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, Simon Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litske, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sunny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul Jorge Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, and Manuel Oliveira. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Dugny, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Turnbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.